Today I'd like to talk about the particular ways in which the social world in which we live makes us mentally unwell. Now, this isn't a matter of complaining or moaning or blaming and getting to feel good that way. This is just a matter of seeing the situation as it actually is and what's going on. It's the same thing with parents. If you're in therapy and you're talking about your parents and the dysfunctional nature of your upbringing, any therapist knows it's not good to complain, to encourage the client to complain and blame, because although this gives a certain amount of satisfaction in the short term, very brief amount of satisfaction, that satisfaction is also mixed up with anger and resentment, and it doesn't resolve the situation. It doesn't move on at all. It's not really getting anywhere. It's just getting caught up in a loop of complaining or blaming, which sticks us into that situation. So we don't want to be stuck in the situation by blaming. And exactly the same thing is true with the social world. The social world is like our parent. And just as parents can be abusive, so too can the social world. But as I've just said, we have to be careful about this, because this insight isn't an excuse for us to shove all responsibility or onto some external thing so we don't have to do any work, and because it's someone else's fault, so they have to do the work or they have to change, not us. That's an incredibly easy road to go down. So what we have to do is we have to see the truth without becoming resentful or blaming or self-pitying or angry or bitter or any of those things, which is a difficult thing. But that's the thing that will help us. So it's about what will help us, not anything else. So in what ways does the social world act against our mental health? Now, in a number of relatively superficial ways, it's easy to answer this question because this is something that gets talked about a lot, and we all know that there's aspects of society that are against, contra, and good mental health. But we won't get lost in talking about those, because we want to kind of look at the principle behind them all, what's really going on in a more essential level. So we don't want to get sidetracked too much. But just to give one example of something that has been, we've been talking about it for a long time. People have been talking about the effect of images, commercial images, in relation to body image and self-esteem. And I know this is a really, really old example and we all know it, but we'll stick with it just for a second, just to kind of get started. So the idea is that because of the nature of capitalism being what it is, it's all about getting us to buy things, and pretty much anything is fair really when it comes to this, because that's sacred, the right of the right of people or corporations selling stuff to advertise it and put us in the right mind frame for buying it. That's kind of sacred territory. We don't want to give that up. So all is fair in advertising, just about. So what happens is we're bombarded with images, and those images of how we should look or how we would like to look, not just in terms of appearance and the fact that we like to be good looking and slim, but also in terms of people having a great life and being really happy and really, really living life and kind of getting it right that way, not missing out on anything, but really living life to the full and being fulfilled and satisfied and really enjoying themselves, really having a great time and having great friends, great families and all that kind of stuff. So that's an attainable image. But the unattainable images, you could say, okay, well, that's not very good because we're struggling to reach this unattainable image and we never can. So we feel bad about ourselves. Plus, we waste a lot of time. Plus, it's frustrating. And the whole thing is a dismal treadmill. And we could say, well, that's not so good. But it is, of course, because the fact that we can't obtain it means that we keep on trying. And if it wasn't for us keep on trying, we wouldn't buy the goods and services. It's absolutely essential that there is an unattainable image. Absolutely essential. And if the byproduct is that we feel frustrated and worthless and like losers, or just take against ourselves and hate ourselves for being not like the images, if that's the price, fair enough. I mean, the fact that we feel like crap does not stop capitalism working. It doesn't impede the economy, could even help the economy. It does help the economy. So that system, we can see very clearly, just from this one example, which we all know about, we can see very clearly how making people feel bad is good for society, for the whole setup. We can see that very clearly. And this has been stated completely explicitly by the founding fathers of capitalism. And like your man says in the film, and I don't know if this is a quote from anyone else, but it says greed is good, envy is good, jealousy is good, anxiety about missing out is good. All of those things are good with regard to the particular system that we're living in. They're not good as of themselves, pretty clearly. In fact, all the religious teachings point them out as being evils, deadly evils, because they trap us and cause us to suffer a huge lot. And so from that point of view, they're not good. But the whole point is that the system is not geared towards the well-being of the individual. The system is geared towards itself, and you'd have to be kind of blind not to see that. It's just logic. And again, this isn't blaming, because we're not saying that society should be different. It can't be different. It's always going to be that way. Whenever there's a system, and this is the thing about systems, everything has to fit into the system, and the system survives by claiming to be for our greater good, whether it's an institution or whatever the hell it is. It's for our good, so we can't question it. That means if we do start questioning it, we feel really bad because we become immoral straight away. So we can't question it. And because it's for the greater good, we have to go along with it. But that is not true. There is no greater good. Because the only good is in the individual. As Jung pointed out, the only value lies in the individual. There's no such thing as good for the system, because the system isn't a person. It doesn't exist in that. It doesn't exist. It exists in a kind of a way, but not in a real way. It exists as a kind of pattern of malignant energy, I suppose is the best way you could put it. It's good for the pattern of malignant energy. Demiurgic energy, we could say. Not that that's a word, as far as I know, but what it could mean, or would mean if it was a word, is the energy that goes into trapping people into a false and restrictive world in order to milk them of their energy. And that's a very familiar idea to us post-Matrix, in post-Matrix culture. That's the demiurgic energy, the energy that traps and feeds. One of the most fundamental kind of things we'll ever come across in the world, whether it's a family or a relationship or society or a group, such a fundamental energy, that is the predatorial energy, the energy that isn't interested in our benefit. And of course, mostly we're completely oblivious to it, and mostly we won't even agree that there is such a thing as the predator principle or the demiurgic energy, we won't see that there is, because we think at worst the system's very inefficient and incompetent, but it could be better. The system could look after us better. So we're not actually seeing it as being necessarily the way it is so that it can feed on us by trapping us and exploiting the energy, our unhappiness, which we feel in ourselves in order to run its mechanisms, in order to run all its machineries. We don't see it like that. So the most important thing of all, we don't see. So moving on from that, if I can try and do what I said I'd do, which is take a more essential view of how the social world or the social system is bad for our mental health. What we could say is that the social world gives us its mind. It gives us a mind for us to think is our mind, and we never question it. And that's the same as what Carlos Castaneda says, of course, when he says that the predator gives us its mind. So when society gives us its mind, its way of looking at things, we become like peas in a pod, because we all look at things in the same way. And it's not too hard to spot this. We're all linked up, we're all enmeshed. It's very important for us to see things the same way as everyone else, otherwise we're eccentric or outsiders or out of the loop and we won't get on so well. It's really important for us to be in there, in the loop. And yet when we are, it's the system's mind, not our own. So the system's running, it's running all these little mini minds, millions and millions of them that are true to itself. They're all expressions of the big generic mind, you could call it. And again, this isn't familiar territory. We don't talk about it that much. We don't think about it. But you can see it so clearly in conformist societies, possibly most clearly in smallish conformist societies in the country, where you have to conform in order not to be bullied and talked about. You're walking down a street, you go and shopping, you meet this person, you meet that person. It might as well be the same person. It might as well, in terms of what they're going to say and how they're going to see things. It might as well. So really what's happening is that the system has created the generic self, the self that, like Gurdjieff says, the one-size-fits-all self. It's a pair of shoes we can all wear. I don't know, maybe they're elasticated or something. So you go to the shop, it's only that one type of shoes. They sell that. And society is like that. You might think if you go into a big department store or a shopping centre that's selling lots of different things, because that's the illusion. But it isn't. It's only selling one thing. And the reason it's only selling one thing is because it's selling the thing that is interested to the particular mind that we have been given by the system. If you didn't have that mind, it would all be equally meaningless, all of that stuff in the shopping centre, all of that stuff in the shops. It's only because we've only got that mind that it seems diverse. It isn't diverse at all. There's no diversity. It's phantom diversity or virtual diversity. Diversity as it appears to the generic mind. So we can say that the system does this to us. Instead of being the individual, we are the generic self. We run around being the generic self. So is that bad for our mental health? We could possibly say, well, what's wrong with the poor old generic self? Let it alone. Who are we to say that the generic self isn't mentally healthy and we shouldn't be the generic self and that's a bad thing? We're not really saying that, but what we are saying is that it is acting against our well-being because it causes us an awful lot of suffering and confusion and frustration, which is fair enough to say. And the whole thing about the generic self is that, quite simply, the generic self is the graveyard of individuality. The individuality has been interred and it's gone. You might see a little, maybe a tombstone or something with a name on it, but that doesn't mean anything. That's just there's the appearance there of a person, or what could have been a person, or should have been a person, or would have been a person, or maybe one day will be a person. But no, not when you're the generic self. When you're the generic self, the individual is dead and buried. So that causes problems, though, and the reason it causes problems is because the individuality is the only one there is. The only person there is. There is no generic self. There is no generic person. That's just a load of habits or software or there's a bunch of mechanical energy running all by itself. We are the individual. So if the generic self is the graveyard of the individual, it's our graveyard. So someone else is living our life for us, and that someone else isn't a person. It's just a bunch of mechanical impulses, mechanical energy. It's just running around and doing its thing. And somehow our awareness is filtered through it so that we can think, yes, this is me living my life. And a lot of the time, we do think that. I think it's fair to say that most people will say, yes, this is me living my life. Here I am living my life. Most people will say that. Wrongly, but that's how we perceive it. However, there is all the same, no matter, even if the illusion is quite flawless, there is suffering in it all the same, but the suffering is kind of very often we're not aware of it directly, but it manifests itself. So it could manifest itself in acquisitiveness, that most valuable of human tendencies for capitalism. Deep down, we know we're missing something, so we try and buy it on the outside, which sounds so simple. It sounds like a cliche. But why does it need to be fancy? It doesn't need to be a really fancy, complicated bit of philosophy here. It is as simple as that. There's something missing, so we try and make it good, that deficit, in the external world. Even though the answer to the deficit is never to be found in the external world. That doesn't matter. It's an unattainable ideal. So what? That doesn't matter. It has to be an unattainable idea if the system is to keep ticking over. And also there's these other things that I've mentioned already, apart from acquisitiveness, such as jealousy, envy. Other people have got it than I, but I haven't. It's not really fair. They're having a good life, but I'm not. Anger, resentment, which follow hot on the heels. Anxiety that I may screw it up and never get to have a good life, like all these other people I see. So all of these, what's Jürgen Trumper calls the afflictive emotions, I think it's him calls them the afflictive emotions, the lower emotions, the mechanical emotions, they're all enlisted, and they all come about because of this central deficit, the deficit of the individuality. And this also links in with Abraham Maslow's idea of deficit motivation as opposed to being motivation. So deficit motivation is where we start working on the basis of a deficit, and that deficit is actually the motor. And we're always trying to fill the hole inside of us, but we never can, because that's not how it works. But we keep on trying, and that turns the mill wheel. Whereas being motivation, we're not doing stuff in order to fill a hole. We're doing it out of the fullness we feel inside of us, which seems very idealistic, but that is how we ought to naturally would be. We wouldn't be deficient if we hadn't buried the individuality. So out of our fullness, we naturally do things, not because we're trying to get anything. It's not that we've got dollar signs in our eyes or rupee signs in our eyes. We're not trying to acquire something. It's completely kosher, completely honest motivation. We're doing it because we feel like doing it because we want to do it. No agenda, absolutely. So in the West, we never do anything without an agenda. Even no matter what we do, it's always an agenda. We're practically. It is very weird for us to. It would be very weird for us to meet someone that did something without any agenda at all, just because they felt like it. We're much too clever and calculated and complicated for that. So even when we do things that seem to be altruistic, there's an agenda. If I'm a good Christian and I abide by the rules, which mean that I'm a good person and I'm going along with how God wants me to be, that's deficit motivation as well. I'm not doing it naturally without thinking about it. It's been imprinted into me, and I'm afraid of going to hell if I don't, or I'm desirous of going to paradise if I do. Deficit motivation. I've got an agenda. And going along even further, we could say that the lack of individuality, which is also the lack of meaning and complete alienation from life, becomes pain. And so things can actually go over into this thing that is often called evil, wickedness, human wickedness, which we may not believe to be such an important thing, but it is. And that's what Scott Peck talks about. Scott Peck says a significant, I don't know how big it is, how a significant proportion of humanity acts so as to repress or stop growth in the people all around them. And that is a thing that is done because out of the pain that's in us, it gives us satisfaction to harm or restrict other people. And you can see how that would be. We delight in other people's misery. And more than that, we go out of our way to have a hand in creating that misery. And that is another consequence of the darkness or deficit within. Out of the pain that's within, we perversely develop a taste for being mean and rotten to other people. And that's, believe it or not, is good for capitalism too. That's all part of it. Especially, I would say, when it comes to people who are higher up in the hierarchies of organisations and governments. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a significant proportion of people, keep saying a significant proportion, a fair amount of people there who are kind of sinister in what they really want, and they gravitate, could be the police force or something like that, they gravitate to those positions because, as has often been said, there's huge opportunity there to exercise this desire. We have to restrict others and to make them feel bad and restrict their growth, stop their growth. And all of that comes from the repression of the individuality, which is what the social system is founded upon, absolutely founded upon. The whole most basic mechanism in society is to punish everyone who isn't like us, doesn't think like us, doesn't look like us. Throughout human history, that's the most, not necessarily in big societies, but in small groups as well, the most basic thing you can see happening. And all that comes down to the denial of individuality. Because when we're doing that, when we're actually picking on people who are different in some way, stand out in some way, and punishing them in some whatever way for that, it's the pain of our own lack of individuality that causes us to punish those who do have individuality. It's a very kind of a basic, easy to understand principle. So that's one way of talking about how the collective of us always acts against the mental well-being of each member of that collective, which is something they don't tell you about in school.